Have you ever smiled in public while quietly believing everyone is judging you and wondered if you'll ever feel enough? In this real English story, I share how I almost lost love, confidence, and myself in everyday life in the U.S. Not because of others, but because of my own thoughts. Through simple moments, honest conversations, and quiet struggles, I slowly learned something unexpected, and it might change the way you see yourself too. The smile that hid everything. Have you ever smiled so well that no one noticed you were quietly falling apart? That question sounds dramatic, right? But if you've ever lived a normal day while feeling completely judged inside your own head, you already know. It's not dramatic at all. It's just Tuesday. I remember one specific morning. Nothing special. Just a regular day in my life in the U.S. The kind of day where the sky looks clean, people walk fast, coffee smells strong, and everything seems to move like it knows exactly where it's going. Except you. I stood in front of the mirror, practiced a small smile, and said one sentence in English out loud. I'm good. Simple sentence. 2 words. Easy. But my brain didn't believe it. You see, here's the strange part. From the outside, my life looked completely fine. I had a routine. I had people around me. I had a relationship that seemed stable. I could go to the store, order food, answer basic questions in English. Nothing was wrong. And yet everything felt off. There's this quiet pressure you don't notice at first. It's not loud. It doesn't shout at you. It whispers. It shows up in tiny moments, like when someone asks you a simple question and your brain freezes for half a second too long. Or when you replay a conversation in your head and suddenly think, did I sound weird? That's where it begins. Psychologists actually have a term for this. It's called the spotlight effect. It means your brain believes people are paying way more attention to you than they actually are. In reality, most people are too busy worrying about themselves. But your brain? Oh, it acts like you're the main character in everyone else's movie. And mine was working overtime. I would walk into a room and instantly scan faces. Not consciously. It just happened. Did they look at me? Was that a smile or something else? Do I look awkward? And the worst part? No one said anything negative. No one actually judged me out loud. But I felt judged anyway. That's how powerful your internal voice can be. It doesn't need evidence. It just needs a tiny bit of uncertainty, and it builds a whole story around it. Let me tell you something honest. I didn't struggle with big English problems. I wasn't trying to give speeches or write essays. My challenge was much simpler and much harder. It was daily life. Small talk. Real conversations. The kind that don't follow a script. Because in real life, people don't speak slowly. They don't wait for you to translate in your head. They don't repeat everything twice. They just talk. Naturally. Quickly. Casually. And when you're not fully confident, every conversation feels like a test you didn't study for. So what do? You smile. You nod. You say, yeah, even when you're only 60% sure what they meant. And then later, your brain punishes you for it. Why didn't you say more? That sounded awkward. They probably think you're not interesting. It's exhausting. Not physically, but mentally. Emotionally. I remember sitting at a table once, surrounded by normal conversation. People laughing, sharing stories, interrupting each other in that natural, relaxed way. And I was there too, smiling, nodding, saying a few sentences here and there. From the outside, I was part of the group. From the inside, I felt like I was watching everything through glass. That's the part no one talks about when it comes to learning English or adapting to life. It's not just vocabulary. It's identity. It's confidence. It's how you see yourself when you speak. And here's something even more uncomfortable. The more you think you're being judged, the more you act differently, and the more awkward you actually feel. It becomes a loop. Brain says, "You're not good enough." You act cautious. Conversation feels unnatural. Brain says, "See? I was right." Loop confirmed. There's real science behind this too. When you feel anxious, your brain activates what's called the amygdala, the part responsible for fear. It doesn't care if the danger is real or imagined. It just reacts. And when that happens, your ability to think clearly, remember words, and respond naturally drops. So it's not that you can't speak English. It's that your brain is busy trying to protect you from something that isn't even there, which is kind of ironic. Because in trying to protect you from judgment, it makes you feel judged all the time. Now here's where things get even more interesting. At that point in my life, I didn't realize any of this. I just thought something was wrong with me. I thought maybe I wasn't confident enough. Maybe I wasn't natural enough. Maybe I just needed more time. But deep down, there was a heavier thought hiding underneath everything. What if I'm just not enough? That question doesn't stay small. It spreads. It touches everything. How you speak, how you act, how you love, how you show up in your own life. And that's exactly what started happening to me. Even in my relationship, I began to hold back. Not because the other person did anything wrong, but because I was constantly filtering myself, thinking before speaking, adjusting my tone, choosing safe words. I wasn't being fake, but I also wasn't fully real. And here's the twist that I didn't expect at all. The problem was never my English. The problem was the version of myself I believed in. Because when you believe you are being judged, you start performing instead of living. You stop expressing and start editing. You stop connecting and start protecting. And that's a very lonely way to exist, even when you're surrounded by people. So yeah, I smiled a lot during that time. A very convincing smile. The kind that makes people think you're doing just fine. But behind that smile, there was a quiet question repeating over and over again. Why does it feel like I'm not allowed to just be myself? I didn't have the answer yet, but something was about to happen, something small, almost invisible, that would begin to change everything. Not a big event, not a dramatic moment, just a simple question from someone that I didn't expect at all. And somehow, that question would expose everything I had been hiding, even from myself. A simple question, deep fear. What do you usually do for fun? That was it. That was the question.
No complicated vocabulary.
No fast speech. No pressure, at least not on the surface. Just a normal, friendly question, the kind people ask every day without thinking twice. And yet, my mind went completely blank. It happened in a place you would never expect to feel nervous. A casual setting. Soft background noise. People talking, laughing, living their lives without overthinking every word. The kind of place where conversations flow easily, unless you're inside your own head. The moment I heard the question, something strange happened. Time didn't actually slow down, but it felt like it did. My brain started searching for answers, not just what to say, but how to say it, how it would sound, how it would be judged. What do you usually do for fun? Such a simple question. But my brain turned it into something else entirely. Say something interesting. Don't sound boring. Don't make it awkward. Don't make mistakes. And just like that, it wasn't a question anymore.
It was a test.
This is something a lot of people don't realize about everyday English conversations. The difficulty isn't always the language itself. It's the pressure we secretly attach to it. The invisible expectations we place on every sentence. Because in your mind, you're not just answering a question. You're proving your worth. So I did what most people do in that situation. I smiled. I paused for just a second, maybe two, And then I gave a safe answer. I like watching movies. And sometimes walking.
Grammatically fine.
Completely understandable. And completely empty. The conversation moved on. No one laughed at me. No one looked confused. No one judged me out loud. But inside, my brain exploded. Why did you say it like that? That sounded so boring. You should have said more. You had time. Why didn't you think faster? It's almost funny when you look at it from the outside. Nothing bad happened. In fact, everything went smoothly. But inside, it felt like failure. That's the hidden struggle. It's not about what actually happens. It's about what your brain thinks happened. There's a psychological concept called cognitive distortion. It's when your mind takes a normal situation and twists it into something negative. You filter out the neutral or positive parts and focus only on what feels wrong. And in that moment, my brain did exactly that. It ignored the fact that I answered clearly. It ignored the fact that the conversation continued naturally. It ignored the fact that no one reacted negatively. Instead, it created a story. You're not interesting. You don't belong here. And once that story starts repeating, it becomes your reality. Here's where things get even more interesting. Later that day, I replayed that exact moment again. Not once. Not twice. Maybe 10 times. Maybe more. Same question. Same answer. But each time, the version in my head got worse. In one version, I sounded more awkward. In another, people looked slightly bored. In another, I imagined a small pause that probably never even existed. That's how memory works when it's mixed with emotion. It doesn't replay reality. It edits it. So what started as a simple conversation slowly turned into proof that I wasn't good enough. And this is exactly how confidence quietly disappears, not in big, dramatic failures, but in small, repeated moments that your brain misinterprets. Now let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever avoided speaking not because you couldn't, but because you didn't want to feel that moment again? That tiny pause, that overthinking, that feeling of I could have done better. Because I did. After that day, something shifted. Not outside, inside. I became more careful, more controlled, less spontaneous. Before speaking, I would think one extra second, then another, until sometimes I just didn't speak at all, because silence felt safer than not good enough. And here's the irony. The more I avoided speaking, the less natural my English became. Not because I was forgetting words, but because I wasn't using them freely anymore. Language is like a muscle, but confidence? That's the permission to use it. Without that permission, even simple sentences feel heavy. Now, here's where the story takes a turn I didn't expect. A few days later, I met the same person again. Same energy. Same casual vibe. Nothing intense. And at some point, they smiled and said something that caught me completely off guard. You're really quiet. Are you always like this? It wasn't rude. It wasn't judgmental. It was curious. But to me, it felt like exposure. Like everything I had been trying to hide was suddenly visible. My first reaction wasn't to answer. It was to defend. Not out loud, but inside. I'm not quiet. I just don't talk much in English. I just need more time. But none of those thoughts came out. Instead, I gave another small smile. Yeah, I guess I'm a little quiet. And in that moment, something uncomfortable happened. For the first time, I heard myself say it. I'm quiet. Not, I feel quiet. Not, I'm learning. Just, I'm quiet. A label. A definition. And once you say something like that out loud, your brain starts to believe it even more. That's how identity slowly builds, through repeated thoughts and small statements you don't even question. But here's the part one didn't realize back then. That simple question, what do you do for fun, was never the real problem. The real problem was this. I didn't feel safe being myself. Not because of others, but because of how I saw myself. And until that changed, every question would feel like pressure. Every conversation would feel like a test. Every silence would feel like proof. But something was about to challenge that belief in a way I couldn't ignore. Not through a lesson, not through practice, but through a person who didn't see me the way I saw myself. And that changed everything, slowly, quietly, and in a way I never expected. Silent days, loud thoughts. Imagine sitting in a room where no one is talking to you, but your mind won't stop speaking. Not in a helpful way. Not in a calm, supportive voice, but in a constant stream of tiny comments, quiet judgments, and questions that don't really want answers. That was my normal. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. I still went through my days. I still showed up, smiled, responded when needed. If someone asked, "How are you?" I had the answer ready. "I'm good." Again, two simple words. Still not true. Because inside, it felt like I was living in two different worlds at the same time. One world was quiet, controlled, predictable. The other one, inside my head, was loud, fast, and exhausting. And the strange part? The louder my thoughts became, the quieter I became in real life. You would think it works the other way around, that if you're quiet outside, your mind would be calm. But no. Silence doesn't reduce noise. It amplifies it. Especially when that silence is filled with overthinking. Let me show you what I mean. I started building a routine. Not because I loved routines, but because routines felt safe. When your environment is predictable, your brain has fewer surprises to react to. So I would wake up, go through familiar actions, listen to English in controlled ways, short videos, simple conversations, slow speech. Things I could pause, replay, understand. That part actually helped. Research shows that repeated exposure to language in low-pressure environments improves comprehension and confidence. Your brain forms patterns. It gets used to sounds, rhythm, structure. So, technically, I was improving. I understood more. I recognized more words. I could even predict what people were about to say sometimes. But here's the twist. Understanding more didn't make me speak more. It just made me overthink more accurately. Before, I didn't know what I didn't know. Now, I knew exactly where I was not good enough. That's a dangerous place to be, because now your brain has better material to criticize you with. You understood that, but you didn't respond fast enough. You know that word. Why didn't you use it? You could have said something better. It's like your brain upgraded its vocabulary just to judge you more clearly. And over time, something subtle started to happen. I stopped trusting my first instinct. Instead of speaking naturally, I started editing everything before it came out. One sentence became 3 versions in my head. Option 1. Simple, safe, boring. Option 2. Better, but risky. Option 3. Maybe more natural, but what if it sounds wrong? And while I was choosing, the moment passed. Conversation moved on. Opportunity gone. That's how you slowly disappear in conversations. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you're trying too hard to say it perfectly. Now here's something most people won't admit. Sometimes I didn't stay quiet because I had to. I stayed quiet because it felt easier. Because speaking meant risking that uncomfortable feeling again. That tiny pause. That invisible judgment. That internal voice waiting to say, that wasn't good. Silence became a shield, but also a cage. And the longer I stayed in that cage, the more natural it felt. That's how habits form. Not through big decisions, but through small repeated choices that feel safe in the moment. Your brain loves efficiency. If something reduces discomfort, it remembers it. It builds a pattern around it. Speak, feel anxious, avoid next time. Stay quiet, feel safe, repeat. Pattern confirmed. And after a while, you don't even question it anymore. This is just how I am. That sentence is powerful because once you believe that, you stop trying to change it. You stop seeing it as a phase. You start seeing it as identity. I'm just a quiet person. I'm not good at conversations. I'm better at listening. Sounds reasonable, right? But here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes those statements aren't facts. They're adaptations. They're ways your brain protects you from discomfort by turning it into personality. And I was deep inside that pattern. Days became predictable. Calm on the outside. Busy on the inside. I would sit somewhere, listen to conversations around me, understand most of it, and still not join in. Not because I couldn't, but because something inside me said, not now. Not worth it. Stay safe. And every time I listened without speaking, it felt like I was getting further away from something I couldn't fully describe. Not just confidence. Something deeper. Connection. Because language isn't just about words. It's about being seen, being heard, being understood. And when you don't express yourself, even when you understand everything, you start to feel invisible. That's a strange feeling. Being present but not really there. And the more invisible you feel, the harder it becomes to step back into the light. Now here's where things start to shift, just slightly. One evening, I found myself in a situation I didn't plan. Not a big event. Not something dramatic. Just a small, unexpected moment where silence wasn't really an option. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something different. Not confidence. Not comfort. But something close to it.
Curiosity.
Because someone was about to ask me something not simple like before, not easy to answer with "I like movies." Something more personal. Something real. And for some reason, this time, I didn't immediately look for the safest answer. I paused. Not out of fear, but because I actually wanted to respond. And that small shift, that tiny moment of curiosity over fear, was the beginning of something I didn't see coming at all. Love saw me differently. Have you ever met someone who didn't ask you to be better, but somehow made you feel like you already were? Not in a loud, dramatic way. Not with big compliments or perfect words. Just quietly. Naturally. Like they were seeing a version of you that you hadn't even allowed yourself to see yet. That's how it started. It wasn't a special day. No background music. No movie moment. Just a normal situation. Simple, unplanned, almost forgettable. And yet, somehow, it became the moment everything began to shift. We were sitting across from each other. Nothing formal. Just a relaxed environment where conversation didn't feel like a performance. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't preparing sentences in my head before speaking. Not because I suddenly became confident, but because something about that moment felt safe. And then came the question. Not the usual ones. Not, what do you do? Or where are you from? Something different. What do you actually enjoy when no one is watching? It caught me off guard. Because that question doesn't ask for information. It asks for honesty. And honesty is uncomfortable when you're not used to expressing it, especially in a language that already makes you feel exposed. For a second, my old pattern tried to come back. Say something simple. Say something safe. End the moment quickly. But something inside me paused, not out of fear this time. Out of curiosity. So instead of answering immediately, I took a breath. And I said something real. I like quiet moments. Just doing simple things. Thinking. Sometimes I feel more like myself when things are calm. It wasn't perfect English. It wasn't impressive, but it was real. And here's the part one didn't expect. There was no awkward silence.
No confusión. No judgment.
Instead, there was a small smile. Not the polite kind. The understanding kind. That makes sense, they said. You seem like someone who notices things deeply. That sentence stayed with me, because it didn't match the story in my head. My story said, you're quiet because you're not good enough. But this person saw, you're quiet because you observe deeply. Same behavior. Different meaning. That's when something subtle, but powerful, started to happen. I began to realize that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't how I acted. It was how I interpreted it. Psychologically, this is called reframing. It's when the same situation is viewed from a different perspective, changing its emotional impact completely. And in that moment, my brain was introduced to a new possibility. What if I wasn't broken? What if I was just misunderstood? Even by myself? Now, let's be honest. One conversation doesn't fix everything. It doesn't suddenly erase years of self-doubt. It doesn't magically turn you into a confident speaker. But it does something important. It cracks the story you've been telling yourself. And once that story cracks, light gets in. After that moment, our conversations continued. Not perfectly, not smoothly every time. There were still pauses, still moments where I searched for words, but something had changed. I stopped trying to impress and started trying to express. That's a big difference. When you try to impress, you focus on how you sound. When you try to express, you focus on what you feel. And strangely enough, when I focused less on correct English and more on real meaning, my English started to feel more natural. Because language is not just structure. It's intention. And when your intention is clear, your message finds a way, even if the grammar isn't perfect. We talked about simple things at first. Daily life. Small observations. Random thoughts. But over time, the conversations went deeper. Not because I suddenly became a better speaker, but because I became a more honest one. And honesty creates connection faster than perfection ever will. There's actually research that supports this. Studies in social psychology show that people feel closer to others who share genuine thoughts, even imperfectly, than those who communicate flawlessly, but without emotion. In other words, being real beats being perfect. Every time. Now here's where things get even more interesting. This person never corrected my English. Not once. They didn't stop me mid-sentence. They didn't point out mistakes. They didn't turn our conversations into lessons. And because of that, I felt free to speak. That freedom is rare. Because most of the time, when you're learning something, you feel like you're being evaluated. But in that space, there was no evaluation. Only interaction. And interaction is where real learning happens. Without pressure, your brain relaxes. When your brain relaxes, it processes language more efficiently. When that happens, you improve naturally.
No forcing. No overthinking.
Just growth. Slow, quiet, real. And along with that growth, something else started to develop.
Trust.
Not just trust in the other person. Trust in myself. I started to believe that maybe I didn't need to prepare every sentence. Maybe I didn't need to filter every thought. Maybe I didn't need to be better before I could be accepted. Maybe I could just be. And that idea, it was both freeing and terrifying. Because if you stop hiding behind, "I'm not ready yet," you lose your excuse. Now it's not about ability anymore. It's about choice. Will you speak? Will you show up? Will you let yourself be seen? And that's where things started to get complicated. Because while this connection made me feel more open, more real, it also made my old fears louder. Because now it wasn't just about casual conversations. It was about someone who actually saw me. And when someone sees you, you suddenly care more about how you're seen. That's when the doubt came back. Not in the same way as before, but deeper. More personal. What if they see the real me and it's not enough? That question doesn't stay quiet for long. It grows. It spreads. And it starts to affect things you didn't expect. Even something as simple as love. Because love doesn't just show you your strengths. It shows you your fears. And mine? They were about to show up in a way I couldn't ignore. Not through language. Not through silence. But through something much harder to hide. My own belief that I wasn't enough. And that belief was about to be tested. Small conversations, big impact. Have you ever noticed how the smallest conversations can change the way you see yourself? Not the deep, life-changing talks. Not the dramatic confessions. Just simple, everyday moments. A few sentences here. A short reply there. The kind of interaction you almost forget until one day you realize those tiny moments quietly rebuilt something inside you. That's exactly what started happening to me. At first, nothing looked different. We still talked about normal things, what happened during the day, what we ate, something funny we saw, random thoughts that didn't need to be perfect. But here's what was different. I stopped trying to sound impressive and started trying to stay present. That might sound like a small shift, but psychologically it changes everything. When you're focused on sounding good, your brain splits its attention. One part tries to build sentences, the other part judges them in real time. That creates tension,
delay,
hesitation. But when you're focused on the moment, on the meaning, on the feeling, you remove that extra layer of pressure. And suddenly, words come easier. Not perfect, but natural. Let me give you an example. One day we were walking. Nothing special. Just a normal walk, the kind where conversation flows without effort. At some point, I try to describe something simple, how my day felt. Before, I would have said something like, it was okay. Nothing special. Safe.
short, closed.
But this time I said, it felt slow but not in a bad way. More like calm. I liked it. Again, not perfect English. But something changed.
I didn't rush.
I didn't correct myself mid-sentence. I didn't stop to find a better word. I just kept going. And the reaction? Not judgment. Not confusion. Just connection. Yeah, they said. That sounds like a good kind of slow. That moment might seem small. But for me, it was huge. Because for the first time, I didn't feel like I was translating my thoughts. I felt like I was expressing them. And once you experience that feeling, even once, your brain starts to understand something important. Communication is not about perfection. It's about clarity. And clarity doesn't require perfect grammar. It requires honesty. Now, here's where things start to compound. These small conversations didn't stay isolated. They started stacking on top of each other. One good moment led to another. One natural sentence made the next one easier. That's how confidence actually grows, not in big jumps, but in small, repeated experiences where nothing bad happens. Your brain collects evidence.
See? You spoke.
It was fine.
See?
You paused. No one cared.
See?
You didn't use the perfect word, and they still understood you. That evidence slowly replaces the old story. But here's the key detail most people miss. I didn't suddenly become confident before speaking. I became confident because I spoke. That's backward from how most people think. We usually wait to feel ready. Wait to feel confident. Wait to feel good enough. But in reality, confidence is built after action, not before it. And these small conversations were my action. Now let's talk about something even more subtle. Mistakes. Because yes, I still made them.
A lot.
Wrong verb tense. Missing words. Strange sentence structure. All of it. But something surprising happened. No one reacted the way I expected. No one stopped me and said, "That's wrong." No one laughed. No one looked uncomfortable. Most of the time, they didn't even notice. And when they did, they simply continued the conversation naturally. Sometimes they repeated the sentence correctly, but not in a way that felt like correction. More like confirmation. That's actually a very effective learning method. It's called implicit correction. Instead of pointing out mistakes directly, the correct version is modeled naturally in conversation. Your brain picks it up without feeling attacked, without feeling judged, without shutting down. And because of that, I didn't feel afraid of making mistakes anymore. Not because I stopped making them, but because they stopped meaning something negative about me. That's a huge shift. Before, a mistake meant, "You're not good enough." Now, a mistake meant, "You're learning." Same action, different meaning. And that difference changes everything. Now here's where things get even more interesting. These conversations didn't just improve my English. They changed how I saw myself in the relationship. Before, I was always slightly holding back, slightly filtering, slightly adjusting. But as I became more comfortable expressing myself, I became more present, more real,
More me.
and that started to affect the connection itself. Because when you stop performing, you start connecting. And connection is what makes everything feel easier. Language, emotions, even silence. Yes, even silence. Because now, silence didn't feel like failure anymore. It felt natural, comfortable,
Shared.
That's something you don't notice until it happens. Before, silence was something I tried to avoid. Now, it was something I could sit in without panic, without overthinking, without feeling like I needed to fix it. And that's when I realized something important. I wasn't just learning how to speak English. I was learning how to exist without constantly judging myself. And that skill, it goes far beyond language. But of course, growth is never a straight line. Just when things started to feel easier, more natural, more stable, something unexpected happened. A situation that didn't involve strangers,
Didn't involve small talk.
didn't involve casual conversation. Something much closer, much more personal. And suddenly, all the confidence I had been building, it didn't disappear, but it was challenged in a way that made me question everything again. Not about my English, but about something deeper. Something I had been trying to avoid for a long time. Because when things start to feel real, your fears don't go away. They just change shape. And this time, they were about to show up in the one place I thought was safe. The unspoken rules in America. Have you ever followed all the rules and still felt like you were doing something wrong? Not the obvious rules. Not laws. Not instructions written anywhere. I'm talking about the invisible ones. The kind no one explains, but everyone seems to understand. The kind you only notice when you feel slightly out of place. That's when I started to realize something deeper about my daily life in the U.S. It wasn't just about language anymore. It was about reading a system that didn't come with subtitles. Because here's the truth most people don't say out loud. In America, people don't just communicate with words. They communicate with tone, with timing, with confidence, with energy. And if you miss those signals, even if your English is correct, you can still feel disconnected. Let me show you what I mean. There was a moment that looked completely normal from the outside. Someone asked, "How are you?"
Simple, right?
Before, I would answer honestly, "I'm a bit tired today," or "I didn't sleep well." That's real. That's honest. But I started noticing something. The conversation would slow down.
Not in a dramatic way.
Just slightly. Like I had shifted the tone without realizing it. Then one day, I heard someone else respond to the same question. Good. Busy but good. 2 seconds.
Light tone.
Positive energy. And the conversation continued smoothly. That's when it clicked. The question, how are you, isn't always about information. Sometimes it's about rhythm. It's a social signal, not a deep invitation. And if you answer it too deeply, too honestly, too seriously, you break the flow. No one tells you this. You just feel it. That's one of the unspoken rules.
Keep it light.
Keep it moving.
Keep it easy.
Now, let's be clear. This isn't about being fake. It's about understanding context. Because in other situations, honesty is expected. Depth is welcome. But the key difference? Timing. And timing is something you don't learn from textbooks. You learn it from experience, from observation, from those small moments where something feels slightly off, and you don't know why. At first, these moments confused me. I would replay conversations in my head, trying to find what I said wrong. But often it wasn't the words. It was the tone, or the timing, or the energy behind it. And that realization was both frustrating and freeing. Frustrating because now there was more to learn. But freeing because it meant I'm not bad at English. I'm just learning a new social rhythm. That's a very different problem. And a much more solvable one. There's actually research in communication psychology that supports this. Studies show that a large percentage of human communication is nonverbal, tone, facial expression, pacing, body language. So, even if your words are correct, if the delivery feels different, the message changes. That's why sometimes you can say the right thing and still feel misunderstood. Now here's where things get personal again. As I started noticing these patterns, I also started adjusting. Not in a fake way, but in a curious way. Instead of thinking, I have to be perfect, I started thinking, let me observe. How do people respond in casual conversations? How do they enter a discussion? How do they exit it? How do they show interest? And one thing became very clear. Confidence in communication isn't just about what you say. It's about how comfortable you seem while saying it. And that comfort? It doesn't come from perfect grammar. It comes from permission. Permission to speak. Permission to pause. Permission to not be perfect. Now here's the twist. Even as I started understanding these rules, something unexpected happened. I began to feel conflicted. Because part of me wondered, if I change the way I speak, am I losing myself? That's a real question. And it's deeper than it looks. Because when you adapt to a new environment, there's always a balance. Between learning and staying true to who you are. Between adjusting and pretending. And for a while, I wasn't sure where that line was. Some days, I felt like I was growing. Other days, I felt like I was performing again, just in a more advanced way. That's the tricky part. You can learn all the social rules. But if you're still trying to be accepted, instead of just being yourself, the pressure doesn't disappear. It just changes form. And that's exactly what started happening to me. On the outside, I was doing better. More natural conversations. Better timing. Less hesitation. But inside, a new question appeared. Do they like me, or just the version of me that fits better? That question doesn't stay quiet. It grows. Because now, it's not just about communication. It's about identity. About authenticity. About whether you are enough as you are. And that's where things started to get complicated again. Because just when I thought I was finally figuring things out, life decided to test me in a different way. Not through strangers. Not through small talk. But through something much closer. Something that mattered more. Because when you start building a real connection with someone, all the small fears you've been managing, they don't disappear. They come back, stronger, deeper, more personal. And this time, it wasn't about saying the right thing. It was about believing something much harder. That I was enough without adjusting, without performing, without trying to fit perfectly into any rule. And honestly, I wasn't sure I believed that yet. But I was about to find out. In a situation where I couldn't hide behind learning anymore. Because this time, it wasn't about language. It was about love. And love has a way of exposing the truth you've been avoiding. When I almost pushed love away, there's a quiet moment in every relationship where nothing is technically wrong, but something doesn't feel right.
No arguments.
No drama. No obvious problem. Just a subtle distance that slowly appears, like a thin layer of glass between two people who used to feel completely close. That's where I found myself. From the outside, everything still looked fine. We talked. We spent time together. We laughed. There were no big conflicts, no painful words, no visible cracks. But inside, something was shifting and I knew it. Not because of what the other person did, but because of what I started doing. I began to hold back again.
Not in an obvious way.
Not silence like before. More like editing, filtering, adjusting, choosing the right version of myself in every moment. If a thought felt too simple, I didn't say it. If a feeling felt too heavy, I softened it. If a sentence didn't sound good enough in English, I changed it before it even came out. And slowly, without realizing it, I stopped being fully present. That's the danger of self-doubt in relationships. It doesn't always show up as insecurity. Sometimes it shows up as control. Control over your words. Control over your reactions. Control over how much of yourself you allow to be seen. And the more you control, the less real you become. Now here's the strange part. The person I was with didn't ask me to change.
Didn't criticize me.
Didn't make me feel not enough. All of that was coming from me. That's why it's so hard to notice. Because when the problem is internal, there's no clear moment you can point to and say, that's when it started. It just grows quietly. One day, you hesitate a little more. Another day, you share a little less. And before you know it, the connection that once felt easy starts to feel slightly forced. There was one moment that made everything clear. We were talking, nothing serious, just a normal conversation. And suddenly they paused, looked at me, and said something simple, but direct. You don't have to think so much before you talk. It wasn't criticism. It wasn't frustration. It was observation. But to me, it felt like exposure. Because in that moment, everything I had been trying to hide became visible. The overthinking, the hesitation, the quiet fear behind every sentence. My first reaction wasn't to agree. It was to defend. I'm not thinking that much. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Because I was thinking that much. About every word, every tone, every possible interpretation. And suddenly, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't just protecting myself from judgment anymore. I was protecting myself from being fully known. That's a different level of fear. Because when someone starts to see you clearly, you don't just worry about sounding wrong. You worry about being wrong. About not being enough once there's nothing left to hide behind. And that fear, it changes how you show up. It makes you safer, more controlled, less spontaneous. But here's the cost. You lose the very thing that created the connection in the first place. Authenticity. There's a concept in psychology called self-sabotage. It's when you unconsciously act in ways that push away the very things you want, because keeping them feels riskier than losing them. And that's exactly where I was heading. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much in the wrong way. I wanted to be accepted. But instead of showing my real self, I kept adjusting it. trying to make it better, more interesting, more correct. And in doing that, I was slowly becoming someone less real. Now here's where it gets even more complicated. The better I got at communicating, the more I expected for myself. Before, I could say, I'm still learning. That was my safety, my excuse.
But now?
That excuse didn't feel valid anymore. I understood more. I spoke more. So the pressure changed. Now you should be better. Now you shouldn't hesitate. Now you should be more confident. And when I didn't meet those expectations, the self-doubt came back stronger. Not about language this time, but about identity. Why are you still like this? Why can't you just relax? Why are you making this harder than it needs to be? That inner voice doesn't sound aggressive. It sounds illogical, but it slowly breaks your confidence because it turns every moment into evaluation. And when you feel evaluated all the time, you stop feeling safe. Even in love, that's the part no one prepares you for. Love doesn't remove your insecurities. It reveals them, amplifies them. And if you're not careful, it can turn something beautiful into something stressful. Not because of the other person, but because of the pressure you bring into it. There was a moment, quiet, almost invisible, where I realized I was close to pushing this connection away. Not through conflict, but through distance. Through holding back. Through not fully showing up. And the scariest part? It didn't feel dramatic. It felt normal. That's how self-sabotage works. It doesn't feel like destruction. It feels like protection. But protection from what? From being seen. From being vulnerable. From risking that someone might see the real you and decide it's not enough. That's the real fear. Not rejection. Exposure. And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Because for the first time, I understood something important. The problem wasn't how I spoke. It wasn't my English. It wasn't even the other person. The problem was this belief I kept carrying everywhere. I am not enough as I am. As long as that belief existed, no amount of improvement would feel like enough. No relationship would feel fully safe. No moment would feel completely real. And that realization? It didn't fix everything, but it changed the direction. Because now, instead of trying to improve my words, I had to face something much deeper. Something I had been avoiding this whole time. The way I saw myself. And once you start questioning that, you can't go back. Because now, every thought, every reaction, every hesitation leads back to the same place. The same uncomfortable truth. The same question I didn't want to answer. What if the only judgment that really matters is my own? And if that's true, then changing everything on the outside won't fix anything at all. That's when the real turning point began. Not in a conversation, not in a relationship, but inside my own mind, where the hardest battles don't make any sound, but change everything. The truth I couldn't avoid. There comes a point where you run out of distractions, run out of excuses, and run out of ways to blame the situation, the language, or other people. And what's left is just you, your thoughts, and a truth that has been quietly waiting the whole time. Mine didn't arrive in a dramatic way. No big moment, no emotional breakdown, no life-changing speech. It showed up in something much smaller, almost ordinary, but impossible to ignore once I saw it clearly. I was sitting in a familiar space, not doing anything important, just replaying another conversation in my head, adjusting sentences that had already passed, rewriting moments that no longer existed, trying to make them sound better, smoother, more acceptable. And then suddenly, a simple question cut through all that noise. Why are you still doing this? Not out loud. Not from someone else. From me. That question didn't feel emotional. It felt precise, almost uncomfortable in how accurate it was. Because I didn't have a good answer. I wasn't in a difficult situation. No one had judged me. The conversation had gone completely fine. And yet, there I was still correcting, still doubting, still acting like something had gone wrong. That's when the pattern became undeniable. It wasn't about the moment anymore. It wasn't about English or culture or communication. It was about a habit, an automatic reaction that had nothing to do with reality and everything to do with how I saw myself. Psychologists describe this as an internalized critic, a voice shaped over time that repeats judgments so consistently that they begin to feel like facts. And once that voice becomes familiar, you stop questioning it. You start trusting it, even when it's wrong. That's exactly what had been happening. I had been listening to a voice that constantly told me I wasn't enough, and instead of challenging it, I kept trying to improve myself to match its impossible standards. But here's the part that changed everything. What if that voice was never telling the truth? What if it was just loud? That idea didn't feel comfortable at first. Because if the voice wasn't true, then all the effort I put into fixing myself wasn't really solving the problem. It was feeding it. And that realization hit harder than any criticism ever could. Because it meant I had been participating in my own self-doubt, reinforcing it, strengthening it, every time I chose to believe it without question. There's a concept in cognitive psychology called cognitive fusion. It means you become so attached to your thoughts that you treat them as reality instead of mental events. You don't notice the difference between I feel not good enough and I am not good enough. One is a temporary experience. The other becomes identity. And I had crossed that line a long time ago without realizing it. That's why every conversation felt like a test. That's why every small mistake felt like proof. That's why even silence felt like failure. Not because of what was happening, but because of what I believed those moments meant about me. Once I saw that clearly, something shifted. Not instantly, not completely, but enough to create space between me and that voice. And in that space, I asked a different question. Not, how can I be better? But, what if I'm already okay? That question felt strange, almost unfamiliar, because it didn't come with pressure. It didn't demand improvement. It didn't push me to fix anything. It simply offered a different perspective. And the more I sat with it, the more I noticed something unexpected. Nothing actually fell apart when I stopped criticizing myself. Conversations didn't get worse. People didn't react negatively. I didn't suddenly become awkward or disconnected. In fact, something else happened. I became more relaxed, more present, more natural. Because without that constant internal pressure, my attention returned to the moment instead of staying trapped inside my head. That's a subtle but powerful shift. When your focus moves from self-monitoring to actual interaction, your communication improves automatically, not because you're trying harder, but because you're interfering less. That's when I understood something that had been right in front of me the whole time. The problem was never my ability to communicate. It was my relationship with myself while communicating. And changing that relationship didn't require new vocabulary or better grammar. It required awareness. The willingness to notice a thought without immediately believing it. The ability to pause and question a reaction instead of following it automatically. That sounds simple, but it's not easy. Because your brain prefers familiar patterns, even if they're uncomfortable. It likes certainty, even if that certainty is negative. So every time I chose not to believe the old voice, it felt unfamiliar, slightly uncomfortable, almost like stepping into a space without clear rules. But that discomfort wasn't a sign that something was wrong. It was a sign that something was changing. And slowly, that new pattern started to build. A conversation would happen, and instead of replaying it 10 times, I would notice the urge to do that and let it pass. A small mistake would occur, and instead of turning it into a story about my worth, I would see it for what it actually was. A normal part of communication. That's how change really works. Not through big decisions, but through small moments of awareness repeated consistently. Each time you choose a different response, you weaken the old pattern and strengthen a new one. And over time, that new pattern becomes your default. But here's the part one didn't expect. As I started to accept myself more, something else changed too. The way I experienced other people. Because when you stop judging yourself constantly, you stop assuming others are judging you too. That projection disappears. And in its place, something much simpler appears. Connection. Not forced. Not performed. Just real. That's when I realized how much energy I had been spending on a problem that wasn't even real in the way I thought it was. I wasn't being judged by everyone around me. I was judging myself and projecting that judgment outward. And once that projection faded, the world didn't feel as heavy anymore. It felt neutral, open, and surprisingly, more welcoming than I had ever allowed myself to believe. But awareness alone doesn't solve everything. It opens the door. What comes next is choice. Because once you see the pattern, you can't pretend it's not there anymore. You either continue it consciously or you start building something different. And that's where the real challenge begins. Not in understanding the truth, but in living it consistently. Because life doesn't stop testing you just because you had one moment of clarity. Situations change. Emotions come back. Old thoughts try to return. And the real question becomes, will you go back to the old story or stay with the new one you've just discovered? That question followed me into the next phase of my life, into new situations, new responsibilities, and new roles that required more from me than ever before. Because understanding yourself in quiet moments is one thing. Living that understanding in real life, in relationships, in family, in daily responsibilities is something else entirely. And that's exactly where this journey was heading next, into a space where self-acceptance wasn't just a concept anymore, but something I had to practice every single day, in ways I couldn't ignore, in a life that was becoming more real, more demanding, and more meaningful than anything I had experienced before. Small wins, big changes. Something strange starts to happen when you stop trying to fix yourself all the time. You begin to notice progress that was always there, just hidden under constant criticism. It doesn't arrive like a big achievement or a dramatic breakthrough. It shows up quietly, almost easy to miss if you're not paying attention. A sentence flows without hesitation. A response comes naturally without rehearsing. A moment passes, and instead of replaying it 10 times, you simply move on. At first, those moments feel too small to matter. Your old mindset tries to dismiss them immediately. That was nothing. Anyone could do that. It doesn't count. But that's exactly how the old pattern survives, by minimizing every sign of growth. So this time, I did something different. I paid attention. Not in an intense way, not forcing meaning into everything, but just noticing. And the more I noticed, the more I realized something important. Progress had never been the problem. Recognition was. Because if you never acknowledge improvement, your brain assumes there isn't any. And if your brain believes there's no progress, it keeps you stuck in the same story. I'm not improving. That belief becomes self-fulfilling. You stop trying. You stop trusting. You stay exactly where you are, not because you can't move forward, but because you don't see that you already are. That realization changed how I approached everything. Instead of chasing big changes, I started respecting small ones. A short conversation where I didn't overthink became a win. A moment where I spoke without editing every word became a win. Even a pause where I didn't panic became a win. These weren't dramatic victories. No one else noticed them. But they mattered because they were evidence, real, undeniable evidence, that something inside me was shifting. And once your brain starts collecting that kind of evidence, it updates its beliefs. Slowly but consistently. There's a concept in neuroscience called neuroplasticity, which describes the brain's ability to rewire itself based on repeated experiences. Every time you respond differently to a familiar situation, you strengthen a new neural pathway. And over time, that pathway becomes easier to follow than the old one. That's exactly what was happening. Before, my default reaction to any conversation was tension, overthinking, self-monitoring. Now, a different option started to appear. Stay present. Respond naturally, move on. It wasn't perfect. Some days, the old pattern came back strong. Overthinking returned. Doubt showed up again. But here's the difference. Those moments didn't feel permanent anymore. They felt like temporary states, not identity. And that shift is huge. Because once you stop identifying with the struggle, it loses its power over you. You can experience it without being defined by it. That's when real change becomes possible. Now here's something even more interesting. As I became more aware of these small wins, my behavior started to change without effort. I didn't push myself to speak more. I didn't force confidence. I simply allowed myself to respond when I felt like it, and because the pressure was lower, those moments happen more often. That's the paradox of growth. The less you force it, the more naturally it happens. Because force creates resistance. But permission creates flow. And once you feel that flow, even in small moments, your brain remembers it. It starts to prefer it. It becomes your new normal. This didn't just affect conversations. It started showing up in daily life in subtle ways. I became more patient with myself, less reactive, more willing to let things be imperfect. And that change didn't stay inside, it affected how I showed up in my relationship too. Before, I was constantly trying to do better, to say the right thing, to avoid mistakes. Now, I was simply present, listening more fully, responding more honestly, not because I had perfect words, but because I wasn't filtering everything through fear anymore. That made the connection feel lighter, more natural, less controlled. And here's the part one didn't expect. Those small internal changes created visible external results. Conversations flowed easier. Reactions felt more genuine. Even misunderstandings became less stressful because I didn't turn them into personal failures. That's when I understood something that no textbook had ever explained clearly. Confidence is not a skill you build directly. It's a side effect of how you treat yourself during the process. If you constantly criticize yourself, even improvement feels like failure. But if you allow yourself to grow imperfectly, even small progress feels meaningful. And meaning is what keeps you moving forward. Without it, effort feels empty. With it, even small steps feel worth it. Now, of course, not everything became easy. Life doesn't work like that. New challenges appeared. New situations required more from me. But instead of seeing those challenges as threats, I started seeing them as opportunities to test this new way of thinking. Not perfectly, not consistently, but enough to keep moving. And each time I faced something slightly uncomfortable and didn't collapse into old patterns, that became another piece of evidence. Another small win. Another step forward. Over time, those small wins stopped feeling small because they started adding up. Not in a visible, dramatic way, but in a stable, lasting way. The kind of change that doesn't disappear overnight. The kind that becomes part of who you are. And that's when something shifted again. Not dramatically, but deeply. I stopped asking, am I good enough? And started asking, am I showing up as myself? That question doesn't create pressure. It creates clarity. because it focuses on action, not judgment. And when you focus on showing up instead of proving yourself, everything becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. And clarity reduces anxiety. That's a real psychological effect. When your brain knows what matters, it stops searching for unnecessary problems. It stops overanalyzing every detail. It focuses on what's relevant. And for me, what became relevant wasn't perfection. It was presence. That shift carried into the next phase of my life, where things became more real, more grounded, more connected to something bigger than just personal growth. Because at some point, it's not just about you anymore. It's about how you show up for others, how you communicate in daily life, how you build something stable, meaningful, and lasting. And that's exactly where this journey was heading next, into a space where these small internal changes would be tested in a completely different way, not through conversations alone, but through responsibility, through commitment, and through a life that required more than just understanding, but consistent action in ways that couldn't be avoided or delayed. Love, family, and real life. Real life doesn't announce itself when it begins. It quietly replaces the version of you that used to have time to overthink everything. One day you're analyzing conversations in your head, replaying sentences, adjusting tone, and wording that no one else remembers. And then suddenly your attention shifts outward because something or someone needs you to be present, not perfect. That shift didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt practical,
Daily.
almost ordinary. But underneath that ordinary rhythm, something much deeper was changing. The relationship that once felt like a space to explore myself slowly became a space where I had to show up consistently, not just emotionally, but in action. And that's where everything I thought I understood about confidence, communication, and self-acceptance was tested in a completely different way. Because it's one thing to feel more relaxed in casual conversations, to notice your progress, to speak without overthinking when the situation is light. It's another thing entirely to communicate clearly when life becomes more complex, when decisions matter, when emotions carry weight, when your words affect not just how you are perceived, but how your life actually moves forward. Conversations were no longer just about expressing a thought or sharing a feeling. They became part of building something real, something that required clarity, honesty, and presence in ways I couldn't avoid. And in that space, something surprising happened. The fear didn't disappear. It changed shape again. It wasn't about sounding awkward anymore. It wasn't about making small mistakes in English. It became something deeper and more subtle. The fear of not being enough in a real, shared life. Because when you start building a life with someone, communication is no longer optional. It's not something you can delay until you feel ready. It becomes part of everything: planning, understanding, solving problems, sharing responsibilities, expressing needs. There's no perfect moment to prepare. There's only now. And at first, that felt overwhelming. Not because I didn't know the words, but because I still carried that old pattern somewhere in the background, the habit of questioning myself, of wondering if I was doing it right, if I was saying enough, if I was showing up in the way I was supposed to. But real life doesn't give you space to stay in that loop for long. It pulls you forward. It requires decisions. It asks for clarity. It forces you to choose between overthinking and acting. And slowly, something started to shift again, not because I tried to change, but because I had to respond. There were moments when things needed to be discussed, and I didn't have time to prepare the perfect sentence. I had to speak as I was. There were times when emotions were involved, and no amount of perfect grammar could replace honesty. And in those moments, something became very clear. Being understood mattered more than being perfect. That realization sounds simple, but in practice, it changes everything. Because once your priority shifts from sounding good to being clear, your behavior naturally adjusts. You speak more directly. You hesitate less. You stop editing every detail. And ironically, your communication improves. Not because you're trying harder, but because you're finally aligned with the real purpose of communication. That alignment created a different kind of confidence. Not the loud, visible kind. Not the kind that feels impressive, but the stable kind, the kind that doesn't disappear when things get complicated. The kind that allows you to stay present even when the situation isn't easy. And that stability started to show in small, everyday moments. Conversations about plans felt more natural. Expressing a preference didn't feel like a risk. Even disagreements, something I used to avoid, became manageable because I wasn't trying to protect an image anymore. I was simply trying to be understood and to understand. That's when I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Communication in real life isn't about performance. It's about participation. And participation requires presence, not perfection. Now here's where things became even more meaningful. As life became more shared, more grounded, more connected, my role wasn't just about expressing myself anymore. It was about listening, responding, adapting, supporting. And in that process, I stopped being the center of my own evaluation. My focus shifted outward, not in a way that ignored myself, but in a way that balanced things. Because when your attention is entirely on yourself, every small detail becomes amplified. But when your attention includes others, your perspective widens. Problems feel more manageable. Mistakes feel less personal. And connection becomes easier. That's what started happening. I was no longer trapped inside my own head all the time. I was engaged in something bigger than my own thoughts. And that engagement made everything feel more real. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And real life doesn't require perfection. It requires consistency. Showing up, responding, being there. And the more I did that, the more something unexpected happened. The version of myself I had been trying to become slowly disappeared, replaced by the version of myself I already was, just without the constant interference of self-doubt. That's a quiet transformation. No clear moment where everything changes. Just a gradual shift where things start to feel more natural, more stable, more aligned. And in that alignment, something else becomes possible. You stop asking, "Am I doing this right?" and start experiencing life as it happens, without constantly evaluating it. That doesn't mean challenges disappear. They don't. Real life brings its own complexities, its own pressures, its own unexpected situations. But the way you respond to those challenges changes. Instead of reacting from fear, you respond from presence. Instead of overthinking, you engage. And that makes all the difference. Because at this stage, it's not about learning anymore. It's about living. And living requires a level of acceptance that goes beyond understanding. It requires trust. Trust in yourself. Trust in your ability to handle situations as they come. Trust that you don't need to be perfect to be enough. That trust doesn't arrive all at once. It builds through experience. Through showing up again and again, imperfectly but consistently. And once it starts to build, it changes how you see everything, including yourself. But just when things began to feel stable, grounded, and real, something else started to emerge. Not a problem, not a conflict, but a deeper realization. One that didn't come from pressure or challenge, but from a quiet, unexpected moment where everything slowed down just enough for me to see clearly what had been changing all along. And in that moment, I understood something that I hadn't fully accepted before. Something that would define the next phase of this journey in a way that wasn't about improvement anymore, but about choice. The choice to finally accept myself completely, not because I had reached some perfect version, but because I realized I never needed to. The day I chose myself. There wasn't a dramatic moment, no big announcement, no visible turning point that anyone else could point to and say, "That's when everything changed." It happened quietly, almost like something settling into place after being slightly off for a long time. A kind of internal alignment that doesn't ask for attention, but once it's there, you feel it in everything. The day I chose myself didn't look different from the outside. It felt different on the inside. The thoughts were still there, the same familiar patterns occasionally trying to return, the same situations that used to trigger overthinking still showing up in small ways, but something about my response had changed. Instead of reacting automatically, instead of following the old script without question, there was a pause. And in that pause, there was a choice. Not a loud, confident decision, not a perfect answer, just a quiet recognition that I didn't have to believe every thought that came into my mind. That realization sounds simple, almost obvious, but living it is something else entirely. Because for so long, my default had been to trust the critical voice, to accept its judgment as truth, to measure myself against standards that were never clearly defined but always somehow impossible to reach. And that day, for reasons I couldn't fully explain at the time, I stopped doing that. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to create a different experience. I remember a conversation, not particularly important, just a normal exchange in a normal day. Words were said, sentences weren't perfect, there was a slight pause at one point. Something that in the past would have immediately triggered a wave of self-correction and internal criticism. But this time it didn't. The moment passed, and instead of replaying it, I stayed where I was. Present. Aware. Not evaluating. That's when it became clear that nothing bad was happening. The world didn't react to my imperfection the way my mind used to. No one stopped the conversation. No one pointed anything out. No one saw a problem where I used to see one automatically. And in that simple realization, something shifted permanently. The problem had never been outside. It had always been the meaning I attached to those small moments. Once that meaning changed, the experience changed with it. That's the core of self-acceptance, but it's rarely explained in a way that feels real. It's not about suddenly loving everything about yourself. It's not about eliminating doubt or never feeling insecure again. It's about changing your relationship with those feelings. It's about allowing them to exist without turning them into a definition of who you are. That distinction matters more than it seems. Because when you stop defining yourself by every passing thought, you create space to experience life without constantly filtering it through judgment. And in that space, something else grows, trust. Not blind confidence, not unrealistic belief, but a grounded trust that you can handle situations as they come, that you don't need to prepare for every possible outcome, that you don't need to be perfect to be okay. That trust isn't built through words or ideas. It's built through experience, through repeated moments where you show up, respond, and realize that things work out without needing to control every detail. That's what had been happening slowly over time, and that day, it became visible, not as a final result, but as a clear direction. I wasn't trying to become someone else anymore. I wasn't chasing a version of myself that felt just out of reach. I was working with what was already there, allowing it to be enough, allowing it to exist without constant adjustment. That's a subtle but powerful shift, because when you stop trying to fix yourself all the time, your energy moves somewhere else. Instead of being trapped in self-monitoring, it becomes available for real life, for connection, for presence, for meaningful interaction. And that changes everything. Conversations feel lighter because you're not carrying the weight of evaluation into them. Relationships feel more stable because you're not constantly questioning your role in them. Even challenges feel different, not because they're easier, but because you're not adding unnecessary pressure on top of them. That's what choosing yourself actually looks like in practice. It's not a single decision. It's a series of small choices repeated consistently. Choosing to speak even when the sentence isn't perfect. Choosing to stay present instead of replaying the past. Choosing to respond instead of retreating. Each of those choices reinforces a new pattern, one where you are not your own obstacle anymore. And over time, that pattern becomes natural. Not forced, not something you have to remember, but something that happens automatically because it has been practiced enough. That's when self-acceptance stops being an idea and becomes a way of living. But here's something important that I didn't understand at the beginning. Choosing yourself doesn't mean ignoring growth. It doesn't mean staying the same or avoiding improvement. It means removing the pressure that makes growth feel like survival. When you're no longer trying to prove your worth, you can improve from a place of curiosity instead of fear. And that kind of improvement is sustainable. It doesn't burn you out. It doesn't create more self-doubt. It builds on itself naturally because it's aligned with who you are, not who you think you should be. That alignment showed up in ways I didn't expect. I started noticing that I wasn't comparing myself as much. Not because I forced myself to stop, but because it didn't feel relevant anymore. My focus had shifted inward, not in a self-centered way, but in a grounded way. I knew where I was, I knew what I was working on, and that was enough. That sense of enough is something people chase for a long time, often in the wrong places. They look for it in achievements, in approval, in external validation. But when it comes from within, it changes how you experience everything else. You can still grow, still improve, still aim higher, but you're not doing it to fix a problem. You're doing it to expand something that is already stable. That's a completely different experience. And once you feel that difference, even briefly, you don't want to go back to the old way of thinking. Not because it's impossible, but because it's unnecessary. The constant pressure, the overthinking, the need to be perfect, it all starts to feel like extra weight you don't need to carry anymore. That's what that day gave me. Not a perfect mindset, not a final answer, but a clear understanding that I had a choice in how I treated myself. And once that choice became visible, it stayed. It didn't disappear with the next challenge or the next uncomfortable moment. It remained as an option, something I could return to whenever the old patterns tried to come back. And that's what made it real. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of awareness and choice within it. That's where the journey started to feel complete, not because everything was finished, but because the direction was clear. I wasn't trying to become enough anymore. I had already decided that I was. And from that point forward, everything else became a continuation of that decision, not a search for it. That realization didn't just change how I saw myself. It changed the message I wanted to share, the way I wanted to show up, and the question that naturally followed from everything I had experienced. Because once you reach that point, there's only one thing left to ask, not just to yourself, but to anyone who is still standing where you used to stand, still carrying that quiet doubt, still wondering if they are enough. And that question is simpler than everything that came before it, but at the same time, it holds the weight of the entire journey. Do you accept yourself? The most important question in this entire story isn't about where I live, how I speak, or what I've achieved. It's much simpler and, at the same time, much harder to answer honestly. Do you accept yourself? Not the version of you that sounds perfect, not the version that never hesitates, not the version that only shows the best moments, but the real one, the one that pauses, overthinks sometimes, makes small mistakes, learns slowly, and still shows up. That's the version most people hide, even from themselves. And that's exactly where everything begins. Because the truth is, nothing I shared with you today would have changed if I kept waiting to become better before allowing myself to feel enough. That moment never arrives the way we expect it to. There's always something else to improve, something else to fix, something else to question. And if your sense of worth depends on reaching a perfect version of yourself, you'll always feel like you're one step behind. No matter how far you've actually come. That's the trap. It looks like motivation, but it feels like pressure. It pushes you forward, but never lets you arrive. Breaking out of that pattern doesn't require a big decision or a dramatic transformation. It starts with something much quieter, awareness. The ability to notice how you speak to yourself in everyday moments, how quickly you judge your own actions, how often you turn small imperfections into bigger conclusions about who you are. Once you see that clearly, you begin to understand that the problem was never the situation. It was the meaning you gave to it. And meaning is something you can change. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually, through small choices that repeat over time. Choosing not to replay every conversation. Choosing not to attach your worth to a single moment. Choosing to respond instead of retreat. These are not big actions. They don't look impressive. But they are powerful because they reshape the way your mind works. And when your mind changes, your experience of life changes with it. That's what happened to me. Not overnight, not all at once, but step by step, through moments that didn't seem important at the time. Looking back, there was no single turning point that fixed everything. There were many small ones, each one giving me a little more space to be myself without constant judgment. And eventually, that space became my normal. That's what self-acceptance actually feels like. Not excitement, not perfection, but stability. A quiet sense that you don't need to fight yourself all the time. That you can exist, respond, grow, and connect without constantly checking if you are doing it right. That feeling doesn't remove challenges. Life still brings situations that test your patience, your clarity, your confidence. But the difference is in how you meet those challenges. Instead of reacting from fear, you respond from a place of trust. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you ask, "What can I do here?" That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because it moves your focus from identity to action, from judgment to participation. And that's where real life happens. Not in your thoughts, not in your analysis, but in the moments where you choose to show up as you are and engage with what's in front of you. That's also where real communication begins. Not perfect sentences, not flawless pronunciation, but honest expression. The kind that carries meaning even when the words aren't perfect. The kind that creates connection because it's real. That's the reason this story isn't just about language. English was part of the journey, but it was never the core problem. The real challenge was internal. The way I saw myself. The way I judged myself. The way I limited myself based on thoughts that I never questioned for a long time. Once that changed, everything else followed naturally. Conversations became easier because I wasn't trying to control them. Relationships became stronger because I wasn't hiding behind a filtered version of myself. Life became clearer because I wasn't constantly distracted by self-doubt. And that clarity is what I want you to take from this. Not a technique, not a perfect method, but a different way of looking at yourself. Because if you're watching this and feeling stuck, feeling like you're not good enough, feeling like you're always one step behind, there's a high chance that the problem isn't your ability. It's the story you've been telling yourself about your ability. And that story can change. Not because someone else tells you a better one, but because you start questioning the one you already have. That's where your power is. Not in controlling everything you do, but in understanding how you interpret what you do. Once you see that clearly, you realize something important. You don't need to wait until you become someone else to feel enough. You can start from where you are with what you have and build from there without turning every step into a test of your worth. That's what allowed me to move forward. Not faster, not perfectly, but consistently. And consistency, not perfection, is what creates real change. So if there's one thing to take with you after this, it's not a rule or a strategy. It's a question. A simple one, but not an easy one. Are you willing to accept yourself as you are, while still allowing yourself to grow? Not one or the other, but both at the same time. Because that balance is where everything starts to make sense. That's where you stop fighting yourself and start working with yourself. And that's where life begins to feel less like something you have to prove and more like something you can actually experience. That's the shift that changed everything for me. And if you let it, it can change something for you too. What if the life you've been trying to fix never needed fixing in the first place? What if the voice telling you you're not enough isn't the truth, but just a habit you've repeated for too long? This story wasn't about perfect English, perfect love, or a perfect life in the U.S. It was about something much deeper, the moment you stop performing and finally start living. And here's the part that matters now. You're not just watching the story, you're standing inside your own version of it. So the question isn't mine anymore, it's yours. Are you ready to stop judging yourself and start accepting who you are right now, not someday? If this story made you pause, think, or feel something real, don't just scroll away. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with this journey, because the next story might be the one that changes how you see yourself forever.